Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. It's not a packed room here, but a very select group, obviously. But I know there's quite a lot of folk who've joined us online. So I should very quickly just introduce what's going to happen today and maybe say a little bit about XpoNorth and the Canada Media Fund. So I'm Ian Hamilton. I'm the Head of Creative Industries for Highlands and Islands Enterprise. And for anyone joining us who doesn't know who HI is, we're the Economic Development Agency for the northern half of Scotland. The purpose of today really came about because we had met up with the Canada Media Fund in the past through XpoNorth. XpoNorth is not only a conference that happens once a year in Inverness, bringing creative businesses together, but it's actually a year-round programme of support for creative businesses. But you can find lots more information about that and about the dates for next year's XpoNorth and everything if you go to the website, which is XpoNorth, xponnorth.co.uk. As I said, we met up with the Canada Media Fund through that, and the idea of looking at a joint development fund to encourage collaboration between Canada and Scotland came out of it. And that was all great, but we thought it was probably a good idea to invite Jonathan along to maybe provide a little bit of a refresher, and also maybe to encourage some other people who haven't done an international co-production or co-development deal before, and maybe would just like a little guidance on what they should be thinking about. Not to replace a lawyer, but just to give them a better idea of what they need to be thinking about before kicking off. So I will waste no more time and not shorten the winter for anybody and hand over to Jonathan just now. What I would say though is if you have any questions, if you can save them to the end, and if you're online, you can fire them in and I'll take note of them and ask them later. Thank you. Jonathan.
Perfect. Thank you, Ian, and thank you for coming along. So, as Ian said, we're going to look at some international co-production and development deals, and we're going to look at some of the clauses and some of the aspects that you should look out for when doing these deals. It's a background session only. It's not intended to go into an incredible amount of depth because we've only got an hour, but questions are at the end and I'm available to hang about afterwards, or you can contact me after this event should you so wish, should you have more in-depth sort of areas that you want to go through. So, we're going to look at the basics, and I always start with this sort of homework session, whether it's on co-production deals, whether it's on marketing deals, whether it's on management deals, recording contracts, whatever it is. Do your homework. Make sure that you know who you're contracting with. Make sure that you do your research. There are a lot of online tools. IMDb, for example, so you can have a look at any existing works, any credits that your potential co-producer may have. You can find out information through HIE, through XpoNorth as well about individuals. They hold biogs and the like. You can find out information about foreign producers as well by carrying out searches through things like local production associations. So we've got Screen Scotland here, Film Glasgow, CPAWC, which is the Commercial Productions Association of Western Canada and the like. So they provide contact details, credits, sometimes agents' details, so you can do a little bit more research that way. The whole idea about doing your homework is to make sure that you are fully versed in who you are actually getting into an agreement with. Make sure they're credible, make sure they're solvent, make sure they've actually got an organisation or a company that's actually got some money in the bank, especially when you're going into co-pro and international co-pro deals. And a lot of this, forgive me, may seem very, very basic, but there may be some people online that that's not so obvious to. So we want to also establish at a very early stage what the respective responsibilities and rewards are between yourself, your co-producer, or whoever the third parties that might come into the agreement will be. We want to find out exactly, and this is even if the finance plan and the budget is not in place, we want to be able to just find out who's doing what, who's got responsibility for what, and we'll go into a little bit more detail about that as we go through. But essentially, like any contract that you get into, you want to make sure that what your impression of the contract is actually what is down on paper. And that saves some nasty surprises and lawyers' fees later on down the line. Not that I'm doing myself out of work here, but there we go. And we often talk about lead players in co-production deals and international pro deals, because there will be one party that 9 times out of 10 will assume responsibility for the role, and that's normally the person who has originated the project or brings it to the other party. You want to be able to establish, and again we'll go into this in a little bit more detail, who has final say in matters, especially for things like budget write-offs, budget cut-offs, budget spend, and if there's any sort of power to veto any disputes that come into play. It's sometimes uncomfortable at the beginning when you're formulating a contract or an agreement to get these sort of lead player ideas out. Sometimes you don't want to relinquish any control, but it is, I would say, it's incredibly important for peace of mind and just to make sure that you've got consensus of who's actually doing what. You want to be able to put that to bed relatively easy so you can concentrate on doing what it is that you do best. So let's look at co-development agreements and some of the more common aspects that we would want to look at. And I will say these notes are available for you afterwards if you so choose. So even if you are at the early stages of a project, or even if it requires further development, I would say it's important to enter into a co-development contract or agreement of some kind, even if you get something in principle, a statement in principle that sets out the finance, the rights ownerships, etc. Get something down in writing, even if it's an email confirmation of a rough outline of roles and responsibilities. That can formulate the prerequisite of an agreement going forward. In terms of finance, it makes sense to draw up a budget for the development process as early as possible. That way both sides can see overall costs and any contribution that each party is supposed to be making, or expected to make, should I say. There may be one party that brings more money to the project. There may be a party that is responsible for seeking and securing finance, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the presentation. But getting this determination down at an early stage is vital. Again, peace of mind, understand where the money's coming from, understand where the money's going to. And that'll save a lot of sleepless nights, I would imagine. In terms of budgets, again, we'll expand upon budgets in a wee while, but a budget should normally be split between costs that are attributable to the producer's overheads and any costs that are to third parties. So third parties, by that I mean, it could be a screenwriter for a treatment or for a draft or for a secondary draft. So that won't be a cost that's necessarily associated with the co-producer's overheads, but it is a cost that needs to be built into the budget. If any of yourselves or any of the other co-producers are putting in your own money into the development budget, then you need to ensure that provision is made there for this to be recouped. And that's out of the production budget for the film, programme, whatever it may be. And that may be teaching your granny to suck eggs type of thing, but if you are putting money in, you want to make sure that that money is secured and comes back to you from the development costs. Draw up a rough budget. I mean, it doesn't have to be the ultimate end product budget, but draw up a rough budget so you know where the ins and outs of the money are going to and from. It will allow you at that point to verify the scale of the production, but it also allows you to build up a strategy for securing finance. So if you are, for example, you've got a rough budget for 100,000. You know that you've got finance coming in for 80% of that. So the rough budget idea will then give you a strategy for securing the residual funding that you have required. Getting that in at an early stage will allow you again to get all the eggs in that basket as early as possible, so that allows you to continue with production or concentrate on production. Where there is a co-production between different geographical territories, you will tend to find, or I have found, that the producer will normally assume primary responsibility for seeking finance in that territory. So, For instance, in this regard, we're talking about Canadian co-production deals. So you will probably find that within the agreement there will be responsibilities and obligations on you as one part of the co-production team to secure funding in this locality, and likewise your co-producer in Canada to secure X percentage of funding in that territory. And the contract will specify those roles and responsibilities and also the percentages that each has to secure. Tax relief. Well, that's just what we want to talk about on a sunny Monday night in Inverness. But accessing film tax relief and the tax credit requires, has anybody done anything like that or seen any of the application forms for tax credits? They're a joy to behold, as application forms go. They're rather convoluted, as you would expect. They're rather detailed, but you know, if you go through the proper process through the certification unit of the UK Film Council, and that's who approves who approves if your production qualifies as a British film for that type of tax relief process, then it can be, again, something that can be worked into your budget. If you've got that relief, you can do that at an early stage because you know that you don't have to pay that out at the tail end. So I would say that it's important to look into it, to research it, to see if you have the qualifying criteria that UKFC put in place there, and get that sort of nailed down. There are tax relief options with other countries. So Canada has one, and these are written into the European Convention on Cinemata. I can never say this word. Cinematoga. I can't say that. The European Convention on Cinema Co-Production. You know what I'm talking about, but I can never say that word, so apologies. But this covers the European countries, and they will consider whether or not the financial and creative contributions of both parties are sufficient enough to warrant relief. But they also look at the local spend that the production is generating in your home territory, in your home area as well. So, as I said earlier, it's quite a detailed application that you have to go through, but by going through that process early on in the production and getting that built into your budget, it can give you it can give you an addition to the budget because there's a relief attached at the end. So, and let's move on to rights now. So there are two aspects of rights I want to talk about here in terms of the co-development and co-production. And the first right relates to underlying rights. And you know what I mean by underlying rights. So these are pre-existing rights, licenses, copyrights, third-party rights, etc. And these will normally be transferred into the co-production agreement, and this will all be built into the contract that you sign. And it will identify who's the beneficial owner of these particular underlying rights. It's especially prevalent if you are bringing finance into it, or you've got copyright, or there's an underlying work that you're maybe basing the production on, to make sure that those rights are properly assigned, and if it's to yourself, even more so, so that when the IP and rights are split, the appropriate portion is a portion to yourself or whoever that party may be. There may be rights that are generated as the project develops as well. So it might not just be underlying rights or pre-existing rights as these go on. There may be third-party rights that you bring in. There may be finance rights. If you're seeking additional finance, for example, they may want rights attributed to the contract. So you might find that your co-production agreement has 2 or 3 versions. It might be a living contract, until everything is nailed down. But as with all agreements that we deal with at BTO, it's very, very important to understand whose rights or who has the rights and who has the intellectual property. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through as well. So, continuing on with co-pro agreements, we are You have to be very careful about any prior documentation that you have. You will normally find a pre-agreement, a prior agreement clause built in. So any prior discussions, any prior email communications, any discussions you've had at the bar at XpoNorth are put solely to the side, and it's what is in that document in front of you that counts. If it's not in there, it's not something you can rely on or enforce. So be very, very secure before you sign it, and of course you will seek the legal advice of an expert. I know you all will, but make sure that what you understand is to be in the contract actually is, and it's not something it's on a wing and a prayer, oh no, we'll sort that out at a later date, because there are a plethora of clients that we have that we deal with that have unfortunately at the tail end had to deal with the agreement at the bar or the fag packet agreement. So make sure that what you think is happening is actually down on paper, and if it's not, then you have to question why, and you have to ascertain the reasons behind why that particular aspect is not covered. You know, a lot of clients that we deal with, especially development clients, are very reluctant to get the waive a contract in front of somebody else, because it's, you know, sometimes thought of, you know, jumping, you know, bolting before the gate is closed type of thing. I understand that, I get that, there's a reticence to do that, but even if you get something down in principle, even if you get a deal memorandum, a memorandum of understanding, a letter of intent, for example, you all know what I mean by these types of, yeah. So these are things that even funding partners will require in place of a fully pledged co-production agreement, so that they know that there is an intention from a third party or a co-producer to actually finance, support, release, edit, whatever it may be. So if you can't get a fully fledged, or it's not appropriate to get a fully fledged agreement done at whatever stage, get something down in writing, get a member of understanding, a letter of intent, which is a very basic contract, but it's something that you can rely on should it come. And bearing in mind that it may be, there are, depending on how these things are phrased, depending on how these things are presented, it may just be a statement of intentions whereby this is what we would like to do if X, Y, and Z are put in place. Or it might be a letter of intent is binding depending on how it's constituted. So, you know, it can be something that can be enforceable in a court of law. It can be something that is simply just an outline of what we're going to do down the road. But that is depending on the individual clauses and the circumstances. Be aware, no, in fact, we'll come back to that. Let's look at parties just now. When we're talking about co-production agreements, the parties involved don't necessarily have to be the co-producers. They can be other third parties. So these are your financiers, your broadcaster, distributors, banks, private investors, etc. So there may be more than two parties to a co-production deal. It might not just be your entity in Scotland and your Canadian counterpart. There may be 5, 6, 7, 8 parties, all of whom will have assumed rights, all of whom may have intellectual property in the contract, all of them whom will undoubtedly want a share of your revenue from the actual production. So just be aware that it's not just necessarily yourself and, you know, whoever the co-producer is in Canada or wherever your deal is done. And the audio-visual work. Well, the audio-visual work, it goes without saying that that's the object of the co-production contract, but it needs to be very, very defined within the agreement what the production is. And that may sound completely obvious, but you have to be very, very clear about what it is that you're contracting together to do. So if it's to produce a short film of X amount of minutes, and all of a sudden you decide, well, actually, this could be a feature-length film, you know, that agreement's thrown out the window. That's not what you're contracting to do. And what we normally see is we'll see a body of an agreement, and for those of you that are interested, I can give you a sort of template example of a co-production agreement. But what we'd normally see was we would see In the body of the contract, we would see the parties, the formats, mediums that are going out. We would then, the key elements of the contract, if you like, we would then see schedules or appendices on the back, which would, those would be your budgets, those would be your production plans, etc. So it can be quite a lengthy contract. I've got some co-production agreements that could run up to 40, 45 pages. But I would say, especially with international agreements and where there are numerous parties, you kind of want more detail in there to make sure, to make sure that you're fully covered in what you're contracting to do, and hopefully that will make sense. So, what are the objectives of the main body of the agreement? Well, we want to be able to define the work, as I said previously. And we want to list the various tasks and responsibilities for all the different contributors. So that could be both co-producers, but that could be the financiers, that could be editors, post-editors, all that kind of stuff. Post-production stages of the audio-visual work. So that builds into the tasks that everybody's expected to do. We want to see an apportionment of ownership within the agreement. We want to see who owns what, including any copyright, who has the right to exploit, and it will be the owners of the IP that have the right to exploit, unless these are assigned, and we'll talk about that in a little while. But we want to see exactly who owns what, to what proportion, and that will come in. That will be very, very important when it comes to the distribution of any rewards at the tail end. We want to see how the commercial exploitation is to take place, how that's to be achieved, if there are any limitations on the exploitation. So, for example, you may have a film about a specific political, or it may have a specific political message, and therefore there are some funding bodies that are associated with political parties that might not have the same message as your film or your production, so therefore it would be written to the agreement that you don't go near that. Or, for example, if you're looking for commercial financing and your program is, your production is about veganism or such like, then you don't go, you don't seek money or finance from McDonald's or something like that. You can write that in, much like you do in other sort of production deals. But you can define who and what you exploit within the agreement there. And you also want quite clearly to see how the income is to be distributed from these various forms of exploitation. Who gets what, where and when. And, hopefully the project, the production is a profit-making exercise, but if it's not, there has to be something in there about who chips in to what percentage, and we'll look a little bit more about that in a little while. Again, we want to expand upon, in the body of the agreement, the roles and responsibilities, and this comes on a little bit more, or into more detail when, after the sort of previous stages of letters of intent, deals, memo deals, all that kind of stuff. When the project is more developed and it's at the stage of financing and production, you really want the co-producers to set out the terms of agreement in writing, such as what is the production roles, what are the budgets, what are the finances, what are the rights, etc. So again, much like I mentioned earlier, and I'll mention this quite a few times, you need to set out exactly what each party is doing. You want to be able to identify who is primarily responsible for managing the production. So you may take, again, if you bring the production to the fore and it's your idea, you have the underlying work, you may take the lead. We talked a little bit earlier about lead roles. You may take the primary responsibility for managing the production. Your co-producer, however, may have that skill set above you, so you may apportion that or responsibility to them in the contract. but it needs to be set out. In terms of credits, this is always, or can always be a big issue. It's normally the one that they fall out with, or the first thing they fall out about. In any production, there's probably going to be quite a bit of negotiation about the size and type of credit that you get within the agreement, and whether that's credited on screen, whether it's in the background, whether it's front end, whether it's back end credit, whether it's corporate credits or whatever it may be. But you need to get that nailed down at an early stage. So this is one of the big bugbears and one of the main areas of dispute. And it goes without saying that you want to be appropriately credited for the work and for the ideas and for the roles that you have brought to the production. So get it nailed down at an early stage. I will say as well, in terms of credits, we're talking about international productions as well. You sometimes find that there are different sets of credits apportioned to different territories. It's never something to be recommended. It's particularly messy, especially in a dispute. You know, it sometimes happens because there is finance or support from a certain territory more than another one, and it's been the one co-producer that's been able to get that, secure that, without which it wouldn't have happened. So they get a bigger credit in England, you know, whereas in France, for example, there is a sort of equal credit and footing to be expected. So it's messy, and it would ideally be that you're credited the same across the board. But I have seen it happen. In terms of marketing and promotion, well, you normally find again that one producer will take the lead in organising any marketing or promotion. That's obviously in conjunction with the other co-producers or publicists, third parties, etc. But if they are taking the lead, what I would expect to see is that there is at the very least consultation with the other co-producer, and there has to be some kind of mechanism built into the contracts so that consensus is reached. So, you know, by that I mean that you're not just running off getting, you know, promoting, going back to my earlier example, getting, you know, your film about veganism, you know, advertised on the side of McDonald's, Happy Meals, all that kind of stuff. I don't know if you can even do that, but there's a hypothetical example for you. Still with me? Good. Right, again, we'll go back to finance because it's all about the green in these types of agreements. Whether or not you take the lead, whether or not you're responsible or primarily responsible for seeking and securing finance within the agreement, it would be remiss for all co-producers involved in the production not to be involved in the finance plan for the production. In fact, it would be rather silly for you not to be involved. You have to have final sign off of the budget plan anyway. But I have been involved in conversations where, oh, that's not really my forte, you deal with that. Which is all fine and well until the money starts coming in, and all of a sudden it's, oh, I didn't know that this was getting paid for, or I didn't realise that was coming out of that, because that wasn't my problem at that point. So even if you're not primarily responsible for it, make sure that you're involved in the production of the finance plan and any budgets that are happening for the production. The agreement will also have to have in place provisions for if the project goes over budget. Imagine that happening. And normally the producers in this instance, I would expect to see that the share of the overspend would be in the same proportion as any sort of profit share. So they would be expected to make up a proportional difference there. There may be provisions within the agreement that if it's over budget, then there's a default in the production because the producers have agreed that they're not going to put in any money themselves. It has to come from funding sources. There may be a requirement from your funding source that you're not allowed to put your own financial input in, and it may be a case that you have to go back. This is why getting the budgets in place at an early stage is very important, so that you're not 2 weeks away from the end of it and all of a sudden we're £10,000 short, but you've got to put a stop in the production until you go back under the terms agreement to the financing body and ask for more money. So, but I would expect to see that, a provision like that in the contract. In terms of rights, it goes without saying that any underlying rights need to be transferred into the co-production or into the co-production entity. And we've mentioned that before, so I won't dwell on it too much, but you need to make sure that the rights, any underlying rights, any pre-existing rights are transferred across and apportioned. So by that I mean, if you have a complete right in the underlying work and you transfer that into the new co-production agreement, all of a sudden, is it then going to be a 50-50 split with you and the co-producer, or do you get a bigger split because it's you that's brought the underlying work in? So you need to make sure that the rights are properly apportioned at this stage. And you may have, you may not have a problem with splitting at 50-50, but if you are bringing more to the party initially, you probably want to be rewarded, credited and remunerated accordingly at the back end. And in terms of termination, well, we always want a get-out clause in any agreement that we sign. But in terms of co-production agreements, what you will normally find is the main reasons for any contract terminating are the insolvency of the parties, one of the parties failing to carry out a material breach. So, and by that I mean it's got to be a fundamental part of the contract. It can't just be, oh, they failed to pay me £10,000 by 3 o'clock on the Thursday, but it arrived at 3:05. It's got to be a fundamental part of the contract. And we're assuming that the parties are entering into the contract on their own free will and volition, having sought independent legal advice, etc. So the way that the courts would interpret, certainly in Scotland, is that the contracting parties want to make the contract work. So just by having a little blip, it's not always the case that you can just terminate and walk away. There are fail-safe mechanisms built into the contract so that doesn't happen. We'll mention at the end, but you all know what force majeure is. So there'll be instances of this built into the contract. So things out with your control. Strikes are a big one in the film industry, as you know, but natural disasters, war, all that kind of stuff. If your film studio, again, hypothetical situation, is undertaken by wildfire or mass flooding and you can't get into post-editing or whatever like that, that will be out with your control. So what would normally happen in that instance is you would maybe pause on the contract until those particular elements are set out, but that you need to make sure that those elements are built into the termination. Right, copyright and image rights. So within the production, there are going to be copyrights. There are going to be rights of the author. So we need to make sure that there is a clear definition of who or what the author is within the agreement. And depending on where the contract is based, there may be different laws applicable to how an author is defined. So make sure that you are very clear on who or what the author entity is. And I'm not a Canadian lawyer, but the way that they interpret authors are vastly different to how we interpret them in Scotland under the UK law. So make sure, especially if you are the author of the underlying work, for example, you want to make sure that you are properly defined and identified in the contract as the author, because it will be the important IP rights will attribute to you as the author. And you may also have instances in the contract where you as co-producers identify third parties as people that you consider as as authors. And that may be because they contributed something to the earlier work. It may be they contributed finance or whatever it may be. But if you decide that, that's your right to do. Your IP is your IP, but that has to be defined in the contract. That can't be something that you have as a side agreement or a back letter. That has to be inbuilt into the body of the agreement. Excuse me. In terms of assignment, each co-production agreement will be completely unique and have different roles, responsibilities, special features, and that means that each of the parties involved will have their own unique roles and responsibilities, just to make things easy. But one of the main things that I would look to see is who is to be defined as the executive producer. And what is the scope of that person's responsibility? They will have probably final right of sign-off of budgets, of finance control, etc. They may have control of the marketing spend, etc. So you want to be able to identify that within the body of the contract. And again, there may be a very in-depth definition of their roles and responsibilities within the agreement, or it may be as a side schedule or a side appendix as well. But you would want to see that in the contract. You want to make sure that you can identify the party that is signing contracts with third parties as well, and what their responsibilities for that is, because there will be insurance responsibilities for third parties, which we'll talk about in a little while. There will be employment responsibilities for third parties in some instances, which is a minefield and probably one for a completely separate discussion. You want to be able to make sure that it's identified who, as we talked about earlier, who has a commercialisation role, who has any technical roles, aspects. There may be a producer that's more technically minded, and therefore they might assume that responsibility, but that has to be shown in the contract so that, when you get to the tail end of it, you don't have the argument of, well, I kind of did more than you did, but well, I did more in the background than you did. If it's not set out here, that argument can stay in the pub or wherever it may be, coffee house. And hopefully that should make sense. We want to be able to identify who the third parties are at all times. And it should be inbuilt into the contract that the co-production will only be possible if these third parties do what they say they are going to do. And that might be monetary, it might be non-monetary, it might be the commercialisation aspect. But if they don't do what they are supposed to do, then the contract will probably fail and the production will fail. So it has to be very clear what the third parties are there to do, because it builds up the overall picture of the agreement, but also the overall picture of the production. And what you don't want is to get, 3/4 of the way through and you find one of the third parties which has a minor role but an important role, securing distribution rights, for example, and all of a sudden they've not done that well. That will probably put a pretty big stop or pause on the production, because it's probably a requirement for your funding in the first instance. So by identifying and defining the roles of the third parties, you should hope to avoid those particular issues. There is something which we see and built into these agreements called I can only apologise. Siri's now just arguing with me for no apparent reason. And it's rather insulting that you don't understand what I'm talking about. Thank you very much. Where was I? Yes, so what we see quite often in these types of agreements is a schedule of contributions. So, that can be a separate part of the contract which identifies clearly what each individual, each third party is doing, what each co-producer. Why that's important is that can identify what happens in the instance of a fallout between the co-producers, or if, for example, say we're contracting and you breach one of your material obligations, it will be built into the contract at this stage that I can continue, with the production if you fail to remedy that breach within a certain period of time, and I can substitute you for another co-producer within a specified territory. So it allows the production to continue rather than you've breached and the whole thing falls away and everybody's work is lost. So that's when this comes in, and there are other clauses that will attach to that, such as what the default and co-producer would have got. Is then likely to become a creditor of the production and all that kind of stuff. So, but you want to be able to ensure that in that type of scenario, the production continues. And let's talk a little bit about copyright co-ownership. So, and the key element of the contract and agreement is that the co-producers have made these contributional promises and that they are the co-owners of the copyrights and other intellectual property rights. And that can be, ownership of a brand, ownership of masters, cuts, sketches, sequel rights, characterizations, all that kind of stuff. Spin-offs. And this will be something that's defined in one of the schedules that appendices that we talked about earlier. One of the main reasons for having this, again, we talked about copyright a little bit earlier on, but is to clearly identify the owners of the copyright in order to reward and remunerate them appropriately or credit them appropriately. There may be instances whereby, for example, you brought an underlying work as the co-producer, but in that underlying work there is a character that's based on an individual, so they have a right and a credit. They may have an IP or a copyright. I've seen instances of co-production agreements whereby there are song lyrics used, and therefore there's a copyright to those song lyrics. So we have to build into the agreement who owns the rights to those, make sure the proper consents are in places. That becomes a bit of a minefield, and that very much expands your contract and your agreement. However, it's important to get those in place. I have had examples in the past whereby things have been released and these consents have not been appropriately sought or granted, and the production has been halted, and in one case completely the permission was denied, so the production sat on the shelf. There was a great deal of time, effort and money, but it doesn't go anywhere because a vast majority of the IP, it was a production based on an album, so the story followed an album through, but the intellectual property in the album belonged to another party, and they just hadn't sought. Nobody had thought to seek the rights and the consent of the copyright owner. So it's important to make sure who owns the copyright and what the ownership is. Also, what this does as well is it protects you as a co-producer from any action from creditors, because you don't want to be somebody that's party to an infringible right. If it's defined in the contract that you are responsible for doing this, then you can build that in. Then it may be you that, and you only, that they go after. Sorry, I'm constantly picking on you. I'll share that about But the point being that you want to be able to ensure that all appropriate copyrights are apportioned and all the consents that you need are sought and received. And again, that's probably a very basic thing, because the intellectual property that you're putting in, you want protected and you don't want exploited. And I think, certainly in my experience, people are a little bit more aware of that these days. And the situations that I'm talking about are individuals that are, well, they should have known better, but it is perhaps they've been working in different times or under different regimes, shall we say. Accounting, well, how much fun can I make this? It's normally apportioned to one of the co-producers to keep track of the accounts of the co-production, and there is a requirement on that individual to keep the accounts in a certain way, in a clear and concise form, and it has to be separate from all other accounts that they have. I have seen an instance whereby a co-producer who was involved in several projects at the one time operated from a single bank account, and therefore it was very difficult to distinguish the money that was coming in from production 1, production 2, production 3, etc. And at the end of it, it was just an absolute nightmare to try and actually apportion costs. So it will normally be built into the contract that there must be a separate bank account, there must be a separate accounting procedure, and overhead costs should be set out completely separately for each individual production. And that again may sound an obvious thing to do, but if you're involved in if you're involved in a production and something else comes along, and you're at a quiet time during the production and something else comes along, you get an opportunity. Many of us are freelancers, or many of us know freelancers, and you take the work when you can get it, and it's all very easy just to jump on something, and it's easy to get muddled up in terms of finances. So always keep them clear, and it will be built into, I would expect to see it built into the agreement that these things should be kept separate anyway. There'll also probably be a requirement under the agreement to have a designated auditor for that particular production. So, those of you that are involved in these types of productions, find out who your auditors are, find a very good accountant, somebody that's got a creative an understanding of the creative industries. There are a few about in Scotland. XpoNorth, I think, had one last year or the year before. There was some accountants there. So HIE and XpoNorth can give you information about these particular, because creative accountants, which is a misnomer in itself, because you don't want an accountant to be creative with your accounts, but you want a creative accountant to work on your creative accounts, if you see what I mean. But these guys can help you out with that. You also want to ensure that, and this is a key clause again, because it's all about finance at the end of the day, bringing finance in, finance going out. You want to make sure that you know where the revenue is going and who is getting what from the revenue share. And the contract should specify the way in which revenue from the exploitation is divided among the co-producers or third parties or whoever it is that's party to the agreement. Once, it's like any other kind of gross and net sort of contract, once all your audio-visual work has been determined, once everything's been recouped, once all the bills are paid, then you're left with a pot of money. And, depending on how your revenue share split clause is defined in the contract, that will be, 100% to me because I'm great, or 80%, 10%, whatever it may be. But your revenue share clause will be how it gets split at the end, which, is kind of important. So things like subsidies. So, your co-production might satisfy the criteria for being, given a subsidy or a grant, or, given some kind of funding. If that is the case, then I would expect in the contract to say who that subsidy belongs to. It may be that you, as the co-producer in Scotland, brings the subsidy in because you're able to fit the criteria for HIE or film or Screen Scotland funding, in which case you should see a benefit from that at the tail end in the revenue share. You may decide that that's not appropriate, but if you are bringing in £80,000 to £100,000 budget from a subsidy that you've been able to generate, then you probably want to be accredited and apportioned accordingly rather than an even split. But again, that's dependent on the contracts, dependent on the agreement that you've got and the relationship that you've got between the parties. It may be joint jointly owned, or it may be split. So you need to make sure that that's in there. Insurance, especially in international contracts, there will be an insurance clause. It will be a lengthy clause. It will be one that you'll probably skip right over, but it has to be in there, and it will state what insurance you have to get. You know, the usual risks of loss, civil liability, all that kind of stuff. If you've got distributors or broadcasters involved, then there's a thing called errors and omissions insurance, which you might know about. There's a wee bit more information on the notes slides. So that covers infringements of any third-party rights, but that will be built into the contract as well. And in terms of jurisdiction, you want to be very clear on where your contract is based and where you can sue on in your contract. You know, it's normally advisable that whoever the defending party is, that's where the action should be raised. You can build that into the contract. You know, if you have a co-production agreement in Scotland and your other co-producers in Canada, you don't necessarily want to be under the cosh of the Canadian legal system as a defender. You know, if they raise an action, you want it to be in Scotland so you can defend yourself according to the laws which you have contracted with. But there are contracts that will have neutral jurisdictions, which are an utter pain in the neck because it costs twice the amount for both parties because you've got to find somewhere neutral. So, you know, in that example between Scotland and Canada, right, well, it will be under the jurisdiction of France. Great. So both of you have then got to go to the expense of getting a French lawyer or somebody who knows the French legal system. You know, bit of a palaver. So make sure that you know where your jurisdiction is, and that will save it being brought in two countries. Okay, what are we doing? Right, okay, we're getting near the hour. So, other clauses to consider, and that I would expect to see in the contract. So, guarantees, if you need a guarantee, I would expect to see the declarations within the contract. I would expect to see, unless you have formed a partnership, and there is an old saying that the worst ship to ever sail is the partnership, but you may want to form a partnership for legal, for tax reasons. Cross-jurisdictional partnerships are a nightmare. I wouldn't necessarily recommend them. And therefore, in your contract, I would expect a non-partnership agreement to be, a non-partnership clause to be inserted there, which states that the agreement is for this project only. We're not a partnership. There's no legal obligations there. You know, where that comes into the fore is, you know, things like employment rights. If you have employees in Canada, I don't over here. I'm a sole trader or, you know, small practitioner, and that we form a partnership. One of the entities sues the other party. One of the employees sues a party in Canada. You may be liable for some of those employment rights in a different jurisdiction. So it's no partnership unless you're actually meaning to do that. We talked about force majeure, so I would expect to see that in, so that restricts your liability for things that you can't control. Protection of personal data. Well, we're all living in a data world. We're all living under the cloud of GDPR and the likes, and the updated copyright directive and the Data Protection Act 2018. So, you know, there will be personal data flying back and forth, and you want to ensure that there are adequate measures in place to protect that data. You obviously want to make sure that there's a confidentiality clause within there. What happens between you and your co-producer, you want it to stay as part of that agreement. You might give your services for X amount of rate and X amount of percentage to the co-producer on this. It certainly might not be that for the next co-production, and therefore that stuff stays confidential. And in terms of the international one, you want an authoritative version of the translated contract. So don't, as one of my clients did, rely on Google Translate to understand or not understand what the contract says, because funnily enough, Google Translate didn't get it right. So make sure, if you are doing an international one that's in a jurisdiction that's not English speaking, make sure you get an authoritative version of the agreement translated properly. It will be an additional cost, but it will save you a lot of time, effort and money when you come to argue about it. So, in conclusion, there's a lovely picture of us walking by a canal. In conclusion, co-production agreements and co-productions are an incredibly valuable way of often, securing third-party investment, third-party cooperation in your production. However, there are complex rights and obligations on each of the co-producer side, but also on the sides of all the third parties involved in the contract. So it's really important to nail down the fundamentals, whether it's by letters of intent, whether it's through a memorandum of understanding that we talked about earlier, or whether it's through the full co-production agreement. And it would be our recommendation that you get that done as early as possible so that you can set that aside and go ahead and create your magnum opus. So that's me on the whirlwind through co-production agreements. Hopefully that's made some sense and answered some questions. But if you have any specific questions, please go ahead. Do we have any questions from the outer world?
Nothing has come in at the moment.
Good. Well, that either means that nobody's tuned in, or they're asleep, or I've answered all the questions. But do you guys have any questions here?
Just sort of the online audience.
I guess it's a very general question. Just in terms of like development work, do you see that is there like a sort of a cut down version of an agreement that tends to then go forward if the production
quite often, yeah, quite
yeah.
often. So you would get something like a memorandum of understanding, and that or a basic service level agreement sometimes in a development stage that would then, depending on X amount of criteria being hit, would then develop into the full agreement. So quite often you might have a couple of agreements before you get the contract or the full agreement, but certainly in development stages, because you will development agreements, because you'll find that they'll probably come in stages. So you'll hit X, Y, and Z of funding, or get X, Y, and Z parties involved for stage one in the development. Then you'll go to stage two, so there'll be another agreement. And it might be that when you get to the final production agreement or development agreement, it's a combination of those prior agreements that make up the full body.
Sure.
But quite often these come in stages.
Yeah. So the first stage would be look more like a sort of a letter of intent. Is that
kind of, yeah. So it's the basics. So I'm intending to do X, Y, and Z. So I'm intending to secure funding for this project, which I've got 6 months to do. Or if I'm the funder, I am agreeing to provide X amount of funding within this timescale if you get together an agreement or a distribution agreement or some kind of things like that. So, and that would be a more letter of intent type of thing.
Yeah, sure.
Which again, going back to the other points, can be a binding letter of intent, or it can be just an intention.
Yeah, because I guess in development work, you don't know where it's going to end up. The idea is to get it to a point. So a lot of the things you were going through, I can see are maybe not so applicable at that point.
At that point, no, I take your point now. Yep.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions? Well, my details are there, so you can pick up my email address. There are cards available for those of you online. Please feel free to email me at jta@bto.co.uk, and I'd be more than happy to answer any of your questions and queries. Thank you for joining in. Thank you for turning up. Thank you for running this IT, and good night.